Hi. So there's a lot going on right now. The G20 summit in Indonesia is ongoing. Today is the last day. We've just had, of course, the COP summit in Egypt. Um, so there's a lot of big summits, political events going on. Um, and this morning, literally in the last few hours, there's been breaking news of explosions in Poland from what is thought to be Russian-made missiles. Whether it came from Russia or not is another question. This is potentially going to be a serious escalation, so no doubt there'll be more to say about that. But for this video, I want to talk about a landmark that the world hit yesterday. The world is now 8 billion strong people. We have 8 billion people as of yesterday. Now, there's a source called Worldometer. I recommend it. It's a very interesting source because it shows live population updates from the various national censuses around the world. It shows the top 20 countries. It shows past projections, future projections. It's an interesting source. You're never going to get a source that's 100% accurate when it comes to population. But what this does is it amalgamates all the national census is around the world, and some are going to be more accurate than others. The UK has some particularly efficient data. For example, other developed countries will. More developing or less stable countries may not be as accurate, maybe projections only. But regardless, that was the point. I actually watched it time down to the second, to the point when it hit 8 billion, which as I made it was 8 a.m. British Standard Time yesterday morning, the 15th of November. So I was literally counting it down, 7,999,999,000. Um, and as per this source, the death rate is about half of that of the birth rate on a global average. Um, so I'm just going to read out some other landmarks that the world has hit, and several of them have come in my lifetime, in our lifetimes, because I think this is an extremely important issue. So the world hit 1 billion people in 1804, 2 billion in 1927. This is from Wikipedia. 123 years later. So it took over a century to go from 1 billion to 2 billion. But it had taken millenniums before that to hit the 1 billion mark. 3 billion in 1960, a mere 33 years later. 4 billion in 1974, just 14 years later. 5 billion in 1987, 13 years later. I was born in 1985, so the world then would have been about 4.7, 4.8 billion people. Okay? So 8 billion now. So before I continue, that means in my lifetime, just my lifetime, I'm 37, the world has grown by over 3 billion people. That's something to think about. The next landmark came 1987, 5 billion, 1999, 6 billion, and either October 2011 or March 2012, depending on the source, 7 billion. I remember a National Geographic special at that time. And interestingly, it said that the world's most average person, that is, if you were to take a random person from planet Earth, the most typical person on Earth would be a 28-year-old Chinese man, apparently. That's just like, if you get all the demographics and everything averaged out, that would be the most median person at that time. 8 billion, November the 15th, 2022. The UN has actually designated these days the 8 billion day, the 7 billion day, the 6 billion day, the 5 billion day. So there's a clear trend here. We're now seeing this happening on average every 12 years. Um, so that means we're going to hit 9 billion. The projection will be sometime around, depending on if there's changes in policy or a change in direction. It could be 9 billion working on this 12-year ratio, let's say by 2034, 2035. The world might peak at 11 billion by sometime perhaps in the 2060s or 2070s, which will still be in my lifetime. I'll be an old man, but it'll happen. And then we might start going down again. But clearly there are issues with this. Um, it's even been proposed, when we talk about geological periods of Earth's history, we are now in the Holocene epoch. That's pretty much the whole of human history, right? It's about 10,000 years. It's the whole of human history. It's being proposed that we actually enter an Anthropocene, such as the human impact on Earth from the Industrial Revolution, starting in Britain, but also expanding across the Western world and now being seen in developing countries, such as the human impact, that we should actually designate a new geological era. I suppose that's referring to the fact that we've had things like coal mining, oil exploration. This has all happened in the last few hundred years on a big way. Mining goes back to antiquity, but I'm talking about an industrial scale. Where I live in northeast England has a rich history of coal mining, and not too far from here, in the east coast of Scotland, oil exploration is a big industry in Aberdeen. So the human influence on the earth cannot be underestimated. The world's megacities are growing. This is something I've studied extensively. If you look at cities like Lagos, Karachi, Bangkok, Jakarta, Sao Paulo, they're growing very fast. A good example of this is Lagos, Nigeria's biggest city. In the 1960s, when Nigeria got independence from Britain, Lagos was about 300,000 people. It's now anywhere between 15 and 21 million. Lagos State is 30 million. So that's a typical example of a city that is just exploding in growth. Um, and the growth rate is just going too fast from the infrastructure. So roads are being built, high-rise buildings are being constructed, but basically these cities are growing at such a pace that the growth rate is too fast for what can actually be done to sustain it, and it's a very serious problem in a lot of developing parts of the world. Dhaka is another example. Dhaka, Bangladesh, is a city that's very, very prone to flooding. Most of Bangladesh is low-lying, I understand. So where you have these mega cities and they're on the front line of climatic events, and I don't want to get into a lecture about climate change, but um, it is significant that many of the world's biggest cities are indeed on estuaries or river tributaries or coastal regions. Cairo is another example. Even in the developed world, New York City, London, Tokyo, they're all coastal cities. So historically, that makes sense because it's shipping routes, it's water tributaries. You do get some mega cities that are not in coastal areas. Moscow, Chicago wouldn't quite cross the threshold to be a mega city, but the greater Chicago area is about 9 million people. Um, where else do we have off the top of my head? Kinshasa is on a river tributary. It's not a coastal city, but Kinshasa is, I believe, the Congo River's major artery through that part of Africa. Delhi is one of the world's biggest cities as well inland. But generally speaking, if you look at the world's biggest cities, a lot of them are on coastal regions. Now, what's this got to do with what I'm talking about? Well, again, we look at issues like plastic waste. We look at issues like man's connection with the environment. It all figures into this. And here's the problem. We're talking about what needs to be done about climate change, lowering carbon emissions, lowering global temperatures, sustainable resources. That's all important. But I think the elephant in the room, at least partly, is indeed overpopulation. Now, I've been reading Dan Brown's Inferno, and the big subplot of that is about this kind of rogue analyst, I guess you would call him. He's kind of a tycoon, a millionaire tycoon, who projects that the real problem with the world is overpopulation, and there needs to be, if you know the film, if you know the story, it's about this. Basically, it's about bioterrorism. So we need to get in. We need to basically stop overpopulation, and he clashes with a senior World Health Organization official who sort of she also has a big role in the story. The problem with that sort of mindset is it's incredibly misanthropic, and it sort of reminds me of eco-extremism, whereby they are basically against modern society. So any sort of genocidal notion of let's just kill off people, stop overpopulation, would clearly be extreme, and that's not the answer. But I do think that China was widely condemned for its one-child policy, particularly as it involved infanticide, and that was often gender-based. And there was notorious pictures that emerged in the 1980s of baby girls basically left to die in China. They've softened that policy now that the population has stabilized, so now it's a two-child policy. And basically, I know of Chinese people who have more than two children. They're technically flouting the laws, they could get fined for it. But when we look at a country like India, which doesn't have such a policy, India's population is projected to overtake China probably within the next 5, 10 years. India's population is currently 1.4 billion, China's 1.48 billion, but that's narrowing. China's actually slowing down. In fact, China could actually decrease slightly to maybe 1.45 billion. India will keep going up. It's projected to get up to 1.6, 1.7 billion, which will make it by far the most populous country in history ever, even surpassing any any point that China has had the peak population. That's serious because India is less than half the size of China. It's a big country, but it's not as big as China. And like everywhere, its resources will be stretched. And you're going to get cities like Delhi, Mumbai, Kolkata, Bangalore are going to just be exploding. I've often wondered why it is that what the density of population is regarding India and China, because of a similar overall population, but India is a much smaller country. So it could be that India has a lot more villages than China, and that's how the population is distributed. Another curious thing is China has more cities. There's about 200 cities in China of a million or more people. India at 55. I mean, I've studied this extensively. So I think the reason must be because India has a bigger rural population, perhaps. That could be a factor. But it isn't just India and China. If we look at Indonesia, Jakarta, it's again an example of a megacity. The Indonesian government's talking about relocating their capital to Kalimantan, Borneo. Um, but 8 billion, the issue of population in developing countries is controversial because it's sometimes thought somehow taboo for Westerners to talk about this. In African culture, big families and not every part of Africa culture, obviously it's a continent, you're going to have a whole diversity of different cultures. But in many African cultures, having a big family is a status symbol. Now, that's just the reality. And when you see situations like what's now happening in the Horn of Africa, which is an all too familiar situation, drought, famine, um, this is why the mortality is often so high, because there is a very large proportion of children and young people. Um, I mean, the most youthful parts of the world, the Middle East accounts for quite a bit of it, but Africa, I think I'm right in saying the country with the single highest population under 25 is either Uganda or Kenya, one of those two. Um, so you have this generation of basically millions and millions of children and young people who are growing up. They'll be the future leaders, the future entrepreneurs, and so on. But the world is it going to be sustainable? So it's this question of how do we deal with overpopulation and sustainability? And dare I say it, it may well be that some countries may have to look at some stricter policies. Now, this is very controversial because it gets into an area of liberty. Should governments have a right to tell people how many children they should have? But the fact of the matter is, um, if this is not addressed, if there is not a way to feed everyone, if the sustainability issue is not resolved, then we're going to see devastating famine. We're going to see perhaps more armed conflicts over natural resources. I do see that developing. And I'm not saying, by the way, I'm not just concluding, oh, well, let's just blame big families. I'm not saying that. I'm saying everyone has responsibility. And I don't think it's extreme or bigoted to say that. I remember a few years ago, Oxfam had a marketing campaign, and they were saying if people in developing countries have bigger families, well, they're not entirely telling the truth of that because that isn't a myth. It's true. The Philippines, for example, there are traditionally big families. The same with African countries. So it's not bigotry, they're just pointing it out. Um, but I recognize it is difficult to get into an area where, versus you have cultural traditions, you have liberty. One reason the Chinese policy was widely condemned is it was seen as draconian. It was seen as too harsh. Was it effective? Maybe it was. China's population has now stabilized. Its growth rate is quite slow in terms of, yeah, the human population actually has stabilized. So maybe it's one of the very few things the Communist Party got right. I don't know. I think the way they went about it was pretty brutal. For example, forced abortions and also the way that baby girls were treated. But that was perhaps more to do with Chinese culture, and it was quite a patriarchal culture. Um, I remember actually my first girlfriend was Chinese, and she said that in the mid 80s when she was born, the attitude was very different. People saw the birth of a baby girl as not they didn't really celebrate in the same way. Attitudes have changed now. China's become a lot less, well, that attitude isn't so prevalent today. Attitudes have changed. And I certainly know when I work with my colleagues, they loved their little boys and little girls equally. It wasn't, so those attitudes have changed. But I do think we need to recognize that this issue of population, it's often been sidelined. We talk about rising global temperatures, we talk about pollution, we talk about plastic waste. All these things are important, but the elephant in the room, I think, is at least partly overpopulation. Naturally, if there's a bigger global population, more people are using fuel, more people are using resources. It's not rocket science to see that there is a correlation here, but um, I think it doesn't mean that we need to reduce the global population necessarily. We just need to find ways to make it sustainable and make sure there is food security for everyone. Um, it's easier said than done, and it doesn't help that you have vicious warlords like Al Shabaab in Somalia who are actively and sadistically withholding food resources. It doesn't help that you get misinformation about vaccines and other life saving medicine. Religion's a large part to blame for that, especially, has to be said, fundamentalist Christianity and Islam. They are have a lot of blame, I think, in terms of stirring up animosity and mistrust towards life saving medicine. Um, so it's a very important issue. I'm going to round this up, but um, I just don't think we can realistically say that overpopulation, or let's say a growing population, because there's parts of the world that has no one. This isn't equally distributed. The world could probably easily contain 11 or 12 billion people, but it's just that it isn't equally distributed. Many parts of the world, well, I say easily, but many parts of the world are inhospitable. You can't live there. Deserts, mountainous regions, and so on. Um, but I do think this is something that's increasingly going to have to be addressed. And if that means tackling culture that sort of says a bigger family status, then it may be necessary. It may be that governments in developing countries have to seriously look at this. I'm not saying it should be as draconian as what the Chinese policy was, but maybe, I don't know, maximum of 3 children, perhaps. And like I say, it's difficult because it gets into the realm of liberty, but I just think you cannot realistically say there is no correlation because it's just common sense. Anyway, Dan Brown's book Inferno that I was reading earlier, it gets into the main protagonist of that. His solution was bioterrorism, which is obviously extreme. I mean, one of my major issues with the eco lobby is by which I mean the eco zealots, is they're misanthropic. They're against modern society. They would honestly have a situation where all cars, all planes were abolished, and we were living in mud huts. That's crazy. So I don't think addressing the world's problems need be turning against society and saying, let's go back, let's just discard modern technology, let's discard modernity. It shouldn't be that way. Human beings are incredibly innovative. Great things can be done, have been done throughout history. There's no reason why we can't find ways to be sustainable. Let me know your thoughts.